The key slid into the lock of my own home, but the moment I pushed the door open, I was a stranger. 99 relatives were celebrating under a banner that read, "Family means forever," in a house they were secretly planning to take from me. They thought it was a loving intervention to save me from my life. But they had no idea I was about to uncover a decade of secrets that would burn their world to the ground. Have you ever felt like an outsider in your own family? Let me know in the comments. My name is Dr. Alara Vance, and this is the story of how I used their trap to set myself free. My life is a series of controlled environments. My lab at the Institute, my code, my minimalist Seattle home overlooking Puget Sound. They are all systems I understand, systems with rules. That control is my oxygen. It's why, after a grueling 11-hour flight from the Tokyo AI Ethics Summit, my mind still buzzing with the victory of my keynote, all I craved was the silent, predictable sanctuary of my house. The flight had landed early, a small triumph, gifting me 24 extra hours to decompress before my corporate debrief on Monday, 24 hours of quiet contemplation, listening to the rain, and reclaiming my own time zone. The Uber couldn't even get down my street. "Just here is fine," I remember telling the driver, my voice still raspy from the recycled cabin air. I had assumed a neighbor was hosting a summer block party. It was that kind of friendly, close-knit neighborhood. But as I started dragging my carry-on down the asphalt, the wheels making a lonely scraping sound, a prickle of dread began to crawl up my spine. These weren't just a few cars. It was a fleet, a minivan with a proud parent of a Portland Cub Scout bumper sticker, a beat-up Ford F-150 I vaguely associated with a second cousin I hadn't seen in a decade. And then I saw it. Parked brazenly, taking up 2 spots directly in front of my walkway, was my Uncle Marcus's ostentatious black Escalade. It was polished to a mirror shine, a hulking black hole of arrogance on our quiet, unassuming street. My pace slowed. My home, usually a subtle silhouette of dark wood and glass against the twilight, was ablaze with light from every single window. It looked like a cruise ship had run aground. The low thrum of music, bad 80s rock, and a cacophony of shrill laughter bled into the crisp evening air. My gaze lifted to my own floor-to-ceiling living room window, and my breath hitched. My favorite painting, a vast, calming abstract of blues and grays by a local artist, was gone. In its place, stretched taut and pinned to the wall, with what looked like thumbtacks, was a massive, crudely made banner. In bubbly, garish letters painted in clashing primary colors, it read, "Family means forever." The key felt foreign in my hand, slick with a sudden sweat. The moment I pushed the door open, the sensory overload was a physical blow, a wave of heat, noise, and smells that nearly knocked me backward. Cloying perfume battling with the scent of roasted meat, the damp, woolly smell of too many coats piled on my heated floors, and underneath it all, the sharp tang of spilled beer. The noise was a solid wall of sound. Dozens of conversations hitting me at once, overlapping and unintelligible. My entryway, a space I keep deliberately clear, save for a single pair of my running shoes, was a mountain of footwear. Hiking boots caked with mud, worn-out sneakers, gaudy high heels that looked like they'd been dug out of a time capsule from 2005. I took a hesitant step inside my heels, sticking to the floor. As I looked down, I saw a small child, a boy I'd never seen before, with a face sticky with what looked like strawberry jam, run past me at full speed, smearing a greasy handprint on my white wall as he went. He didn't even glance at me. "Tag," he shrieked to another unseen child. My younger brother Liam was the first one to officially see me. He was standing by my custom-built bookshelves, which were now being used as a makeshift bar, holding a bottle of champagne, his face flushed with the kind of performative joy he wore at all family functions. His smile didn't just falter. It shattered, collapsing into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Ellie!" He stammered the name, a puff of disbelief. What are you doing here? Your flight. You were supposed to land tomorrow." Standing beside him, his wife Chloe's eyes widened, darting around the room, as if looking for an escape route. She clutched her wine glass so tightly, her knuckles went white. The word Ellie rippled through the room, then a whispered shockwave passing from person to person. Conversations died. Heads turned one by one. I felt like a foreign organism introduced into a sealed ecosystem, an airlock breach. In the sudden ringing silence, I saw them all. Faces I vaguely recognized from childhood Christmases. Distant cousins I couldn't name. Great aunts I thought had moved to Florida. Then a path parted in the crowd, and my Aunt Carol, my late mother's sister, and the self-appointed family matriarch bustled forward. She was a tornado of floral print and overpowering hairspray. "Ilara, darling, surprise!" She boomed her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. She wrapped me in a hug that felt less like affection and more like an acquisition, pinning my arms to my sides. "We wanted to bring the whole family together finally. It's been too long," she said, patting my back with heavy proprietary thumps. Released from her grasp, I could only stand there, my suitcase handle still gripped in my hand, and survey the scene. It was a systematic desecration of my life. My minimalist furniture had been shoved against the walls to create a makeshift dance floor. My Eames chair, my one true indulgence, had a plate of greasy chicken wings sitting on it. The sound system I had spent months calibrating was now blasting a karaoke track, and my cousin Derek was screeching into a microphone, his voice a crime against music. This wasn't a party, it was an occupation. My eyes scanned past the chaos, past the faces of strangers and relatives alike, and they finally landed on him. Uncle Marcus. He was standing across the room, leaning against my fireplace, perfectly calm amidst the storm he had undoubtedly orchestrated. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, a stark contrast to the casual messiness of everyone else. He was holding a glass of my best single malt whiskey, the one I saved for special occasions. He hadn't looked surprised to see me, not for a second. As our eyes met, he raised his glass to me, a slow, deliberate motion. A small, knowing smile played on his lips. It wasn't a welcome, it was a toast. And in that one chilling gesture, I knew with absolute certainty that I was not a guest of honor. I was the target. The initial shock, that dizzying, heart-stopping plunge, quickly hardened into a cold, analytical fury. Shock is a useless emotion. It provides no data, no path forward. Fury, on the other hand, fury can be focused. I needed data. Liam and Chloe, with the desperate energy of sheepdogs herding a wolf, steered me towards the kitchen. The space, usually a testament to stainless steel and minimalist order, was a war zone. Foil-covered dishes were crammed onto every available surface. My great-aunt Mildred, a woman I hadn't seen since my father's funeral, was angrily jabbing at the touchscreen of my espresso machine. "This contraption is impossible, Carol," she shouted across the room. "Why can't she just have a normal coffee pot like a normal person?" The conversation directed at me was a blur of feigned surprise and the flimsiest of excuses. It was all so last minute. Chloe chirped her voice an octave too high. She busied herself rearranging a platter of cheese, refusing to meet my eyes. "Your Aunt Carol had the idea to get everyone together, and it just snowballed, Liam, ever." The echo nodded vigorously beside her. "Yeah, Ellie, a total snowball. We didn't want to bother you in Tokyo. Not with the summit. We knew how important it was," he said, his gaze fixed on a spot on the ceiling. "Bother me." My mind was racing my thoughts like lines of code executing in rapid succession. Input last minute. Analysis false. Flights from Florida rental cars coordinated potluck dishes. This operation required weeks, if not months, of logistical planning. Input, didn't want to bother you. Analysis, deception. They had my international number, they had my email, they had a key, my key, the one I'd given Liam for dire emergencies only, a trust I now saw as a catastrophic vulnerability. The real agenda began to surface when Aunt Carol cornered me by the pantry, blocking my exit with her considerable floral print-clad frame. Her jovial host persona dissolved, replaced by a look of grave, practiced concern. "Ilara," she began, her tone dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "Honey, we've all been so worried about you." Worried, I asked, my own voice sounding foreign to me, dangerously calm. I had just presented a keynote paper on algorithmic accountability that was already being called paradigm shifting by my peers. "This life you're living," she said, gesturing vaguely around my kitchen as if it were a crime scene. You're all alone in this big city with that stressful job of yours, all those computers and codes. It's not natural for a young woman. Family is what's natural." She leaned in closer, her voice thick with false sympathy. "We're your family, Alara. We think it's time you considered moving back home to Portland, to be with us." And there it was. Not a reunion, it was an intervention. A coordinated 99-person ambush designed to dismantle my life. They saw my career, my home, my independence, not as a success, but as a deviation from the norm, a problem to be solved. The argument that followed was brief and pointed. Who authorized this invasion? Aunt Carol? I asked, the word invasion hanging in the air between us. "It's not an invasion, it's love," she retorted, her face flushing. "And it was a group decision. We all agreed it was for the best." A group decision. My jaw tightened. I pushed past her without another word and made my way upstairs towards my sanctum sanctorum. The door to my office, the one space in this house that was exclusively mine and usually locked, was ajar. Inside the scene was one of intellectual vandalism. My 3 research monitors, my windows to the world, were covered in children's drawings taped to the glass. My floor-to-ceiling whiteboards, usually filled with complex ethical frameworks for machine learning, had been wiped clean. In the center, in bright blue marker, was a sprawling game of tic-tac-toe. My bedroom was the final violation. The air was thick with the smell of a cheap, musky cologne I instantly recognized as my cousin Derek's. My bed, with its crisp white linens, was rumpled and unmade. A half-empty bag of potato chips sat on my pillow. A suitcase not mine lay open on my reading chair, spilling wrinkled clothes onto the floor. They had turned my private, tranquil space into a free-for-all motel. I stood there numb when a soft knock came at the open door. It was Liam, his face a mask of misery. He was followed a second later by Uncle Marcus, who moved into the room with the predatory grace of a shark. Marcus's smile was all teeth. "Kiddo, don't look so grim," he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr that always made the hairs on my arms stand up. "This is about bringing you back to the fold. This little Seattle experiment, while I'm sure it was fun, has gone on long enough." He strolled over to my window, looking out at the view of the Sound, as if he were assessing its value. "We've even got a buyer lined up for this place," he said, his tone casual as if discussing the weather. "A developer friend of mine. It'll be a quick, clean sale, no fuss." He turned back to me, his eyes gleaming. "You can use the money to set yourself up, comfortably, back in Portland." The offer hung in the air, audacious and insulting. It wasn't a suggestion, it was the terms of my surrender. They didn't just want me to move. They wanted to erase my life here, liquidate my achievements, nullify my choices, and force me back into a box they understood. The anger I felt in that moment was so pure, so potent, it was almost calming. It was a cold white light of absolute clarity. I finally understood the rules of this particular system. The game was afoot, and they had absolutely no idea who they were playing against. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. In the face of their audacious terms of surrender, my mind didn't shatter, it crystallized. Panic is a system crash. I debugged it out of my own code years ago. Instead, I did what I was trained to do, what I do better than anyone I know. I retreated. I planned to collect data, and I began to formulate a strategy. I looked from Marcus's predatory smirk to Liam's downcast, miserable face. I let my shoulders slump. I made my eyes well up just a little. It's amazing what you can accomplish when you control your autonomic responses. I can't, I whispered, letting my voice crack just so. I just need some air. I need to think. The collective sigh of relief from my family was almost a breeze in the stuffy room. The palpable sense of victory rolling off Marcus was nauseating. He shot a triumphant look at Aunt Carol, a small, arrogant nod that said, "See handled." They thought they had broken me. They thought their brute force attack had overwhelmed my defenses. I walked out of my own front door, not looking back. I got into my car, my movements deliberately slow and unsteady, like a wounded animal. But the moment I turned the corner out of their line of sight, my posture straightened. My hands were steady on the wheel. I drove 3 miles to a 24-hour cafe called The Daily Grind, a haven of flickering fluorescent lights, burnt coffee, and blessed anonymity. I found a booth in the back, opened my laptop, and jacked into their secure Wi-Fi. My war room was now operational. My first move was to tunnel into my home network. My security system wasn't some off-the-shelf consumer product. It was my own design, a network of discrete micro-cameras and sensors running on a closed-loop system, all feeding into a partitioned, encrypted server I kept in the cloud. My own digital ghost. They hadn't found them. Of course they hadn't. You can't find what you don't even know to look for. For the next 2 hours, fueled by bitter black coffee, I downloaded footage. It was worse than I imagined. I watched them arrive in a coordinated swarm, a time-stamped invasion. 1403. Liam disables the main alarm panel with my emergency code. I felt a flash of hot rage at that. 1405. Chloe, smiling like a game show hostess, directs Great Aunt Mildred and her husband to the upstairs master suite, my bedroom. 1420. I watched my Uncle Marcus walking through my living room with another man, someone short and weaselly with shifty eyes. Marcus pointed out the custom millwork, the view of the sound, clapping the man on the back. "A great investment," the camera's microphone picked up Marcus saying. "Solid bones. The developer friend, no doubt." The evidence was pristine. It was irrefutable. My next move was more subtle. I activated a series of low-level diagnostic programs within my home's network, a digital census. I ran a network analysis capturing the unique MAC address of every single device connected to my Wi-Fi. It was almost laughable. The device names scrolled down my screen: Aunt Carol's iPad, Chloe's girl boss's iPhone, Derek's The Man Galaxy S24. Arrogant and utterly oblivious. I now had a digital roster of every single occupier. They thought they had occupied my home, but in reality I was already inside their pockets. But the most crucial discovery, the one that changed the entire equation, came last. I was about to log off when I remembered a background script I had running on my home office desktop. It was a simple keylogger, a relic from a minor security scare years ago, designed to alert me to unauthorized use. The probability of them having used my main computer was low, but I had to check the variable. My breath caught. The log wasn't empty. Someone had used my desktop that very afternoon while I was 30,000 feet over the Pacific. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the log file. The searches were chillingly specific. 1512 Seattle property law co-owner rights. 1514 forcing sale of jointly owned property. Washington State. 1517 how to expedite property appraisal, Seattle. And then I saw it. The final entry logged at 1521. Vance Holdings, LLC dissolution records. The words seemed to float off the screen. Vance Holdings, LLC, my father's company. A small, unassuming real estate venture that had been defunct for over a decade since his death. I remembered him talking about it, but the details were hazy, a relic from a past I thought was settled. Why in God's name? Were they looking that up now? It was a thread, a loose variable in their otherwise straightforward, brutish equation. It was a piece of data that didn't fit the loving intervention narrative, and it felt critical. A surge of pure cold adrenaline shot through me. This wasn't just a family coup. It was something more complex, something with a history. They thought they were dealing with their quiet, nerdy Ellie, the girl who was better with books than with people. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who could and would dismantle their entire operation from a laptop in a coffee shop 3 miles away. My counteroffensive had begun. First step, find a secure, anonymous hotel. Check. Second step, find out everything there is to know about Vance Holdings, LLC, and unearth whatever ghost my father had left behind. I checked into a sterile, anonymous hotel downtown. The kind of place with beige walls, abstract art that means nothing, and key cards that get wiped clean after every guest. It was the absolute antithesis of my now violated home. It was impersonal, clean, and most importantly, secure. This sterile room was my new lab. From this new base of operations, I started pulling on the thread of Vance Holdings, LLC. The digital trail was cold a ghost in the machine of public records. Corporate entities are designed to be opaque, and this one was a masterclass in it. I knew that data alone wouldn't be enough. Algorithms can find patterns, but they can't interpret whispers. They can't understand human motivation, fear, or guilt. For that, I needed human intelligence. I pulled up the digital roster I'd compiled, the list of names connected to the devices occupying my home. I scanned the list, my mind running a threat assessment on each one. Uncle David, loyal to Marcus, Cousin Jennifer, completely under Aunt Carol's thumb. Most were part of the core group, the true believers in the family means forever cult. But then my cursor hovered over one name. Maya, my 20-year-old cousin. She was a bright, tech-savvy computer science student at the University of Washington. In our brief interactions at past family holidays, she'd always seemed a little out of place, her eyes a little too observant as she watched the family drama unfold from the sidelines. She admired my career, I knew. She'd once cornered me at Thanksgiving, peppering me with questions about neural networks and ethical AI, her eyes shining with genuine curiosity. She wasn't one of them. She was my best shot, maybe my only shot, at an inside source. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen. This had to be perfect, not demanding, not angry, vulnerable. I typed out a carefully worded text. Hey Maya, I know this is random, and I'm so sorry to even ask. But I'm just so overwhelmed by all this. Can you talk for a minute? Privately, I hit send. The delivered receipt appeared. I watched the screen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. 1 minute passed, then 2. The 3 dots of the typing indicator appeared, then disappeared. My stomach clenched. Had I miscalculated? Was she more loyal than I thought? For a full 5 minutes there was nothing. I was about to give up, to write her off as a failed asset, when a reply finally came through. It read, I can't talk, but I'm so sorry, Ilara. This is all wrong. Meet me tomorrow, 10 a.m., the coffee shop by the university bookstore. Come alone. The apology, the secrecy, the explicit instruction to come alone, it confirmed everything. Maya wasn't just a potential source. She was a dissident. The next morning, the little university coffee shop was bustling with students, the noise a perfect cover. Maya was already there, tucked into a corner booth. She looked nervous, clutching a latte like a shield, her eyes darting towards the door every few seconds. They think you've gone to a friend's house, she whispered as I slid into the booth, her voice low and urgent. Liam told everyone you just needed to cool off, and that you'd be back once you came to your senses. She explained that the planning had been going on for 2 months. It started as a rambling email chain from Aunt Carol about reconnecting as a family, but Uncle Marcus quickly and quietly took the reins. He funded the flights for the out-of-state relatives. He was the one who framed the whole thing as a loving intervention to save me from my lonely, work-obsessed life. But then her expression darkened. I overheard things, Ilara, she said, leaning in closer. Stupid things they said, thinking I was just some kid playing on my phone. A few nights ago, I heard Marcus, your brother, and my dad talking in the kitchen. Marcus was angry, really angry. He said something about your father's mess, and how Liam needed to handle you before the deadline. The deadline, another critical piece of data. My mind latched onto it. Did they mention anything else I pressed, keeping my voice even? Any specifics? Maya bit her lip, thinking. Something about a house but not yours, an old one. He mentioned a street name. It was weird, like Whisperwind Lane. My blood ran cold. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Whisperwind Lane. That was in a quiet, leafy suburb of Portland. It was where my grandparents used to live. The house had been sold over 15 years ago, shortly after they passed. Or, so I had been told. This new information didn't fit the narrative of a simple, greedy property grab in Seattle. This was deeper, more complicated. It was a ghost from my father's past. After Maya left, after she gave my hand a quick, reassuring squeeze and promised to feed me any more information she could, I sat there for a long time, the noise of the coffee shop fading into a dull roar. I forgot about my violated home. I forgot about the karaoke machine and the jam-smeared walls. All of it was just a symptom. The disease was somewhere else entirely. I focused my research. I dove into the public property records for Multnomah County, Portland, searching for an old forgotten house on Whisperwind Lane and a defunct company called Vance Holdings, LLC. It was time to see what kind of skeletons my father had left behind. The digital breadcrumbs led me down a rabbit hole so deep I felt the pressure change in my ears. For hours my hotel room was silent, save for the furious clicking of my keyboard and the low hum of the air conditioner. My world shrank to the glowing rectangle of my laptop screen. This was not a simple Google search. This was digital archaeology. I was peeling back the layers of shell corporations, cross-referencing LLC registrations with public property deeds, and running scripts to find connections between names and addresses that were decades old. Vance Holdings, LLC. It wasn't just defunct. It was a hornet's nest of legal entanglements. A ghost ship weighted down with liens and bad debt left to drift in the forgotten backwaters of corporate registries. And the house on Whisperwind Lane? It hadn't been sold. It had been leveraged, and leveraged again. It was the first domino in a chain reaction of financial desperation. The image I held of my father, a kind, gentle, fiscally cautious man who always bought the store brand and lectured me about the importance of a 401k, began to fracture. The man I was discovering in these brittle, scanned documents was a stranger, a gambler who had bet the farm lost and then bet it again using family properties as his poker chips. He had gotten in deep, in a series of increasingly risky commercial real estate investments that had all imploded shortly before his fatal heart attack. I felt a pang of sorrow so sharp it almost made me stop. Was his heart attack just a medical event, or the final tragic outcome of a stress he had hidden from us all? His company hadn't been dissolved. It had been propped up on life support by a single shadowy creditor who had quietly assumed all its toxic assets. Who would do that? Why would anyone take on a portfolio of pure debt? I spent 2 hours cross-referencing incorporation documents from Oregon with tax records filed in Delaware, a state notorious for its corporate secrecy. And then I found it. A holding company, M Venture Capital Group, was listed as the sole creditor, and after another 30 minutes of peeling back its layers, I found the name of its sole registered owner, my Uncle Marcus. The pieces didn't just click into place. They slammed together with the force of a tectonic shift, rearranging the entire landscape of my past. Marcus hadn't been a passive bystander to my father's struggles. He had been his partner. And when things went south, he had become his predator. He had bailed my father out, yes, but in exchange, he had taken control of the debt itself, holding it over our family like the sword of Damocles. For 10 long years, he had let it lie dormant, a secret weapon just waiting. Why now? The question burned in my mind. I pivoted immediately, my fingers flying across the keyboard, running a deep financial diagnostic on Marcus himself. The picture that emerged was stark. His portfolio, heavily invested in now vacant downtown commercial real estate, had taken a catastrophic hit post-pandemic. He was bleeding money. He was over-leveraged, and a series of his own massive loans were coming due. The deadline Maya had overheard. It had to be his. He needed liquidity, and he needed it yesterday. My Seattle property with its skyrocketing market value and my significant equity, it wasn't just a nice to have, it was his lifeline. But how could he touch my house? Liam and I owned it outright under our own names. My father's name wasn't on the deed. It made no legal sense. There had to be another document, another connection. I kept digging, my eyes burning from staring at the screen. I searched County Archives land use permits, anything with the Vance name on it from the last 15 years. And then I found it. It was buried deep in the digital archives of the King County Recorder's Office, a poor quality scan of a 10-year-old form mislabeled and almost lost. It was a personal guarantee. My father's familiar looping signature was at the bottom. It was dated just 3 months before his death. It was from a last-ditch effort to secure a final desperate loan from Marcus to keep everything afloat. My hands trembled as I zoomed in on the fine print. It was a masterpiece of legal obfuscation, dense and nearly unreadable. But I read every single word. He hadn't just guaranteed the loan with his own assets. He had signed a clause, a venomous tangled string of legalese, that pledged not only his own future earnings, but also a portion of the inheritance he would one day pass on to his children. He had, in effect, put a lien on my future success, on me. And Liam knew. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Of course he knew. Marcus would have made sure of it. He would have held this over Liam's head for years, a constant, terrifying threat. It explained Liam's fear, his weakness, his immediate capitulation to Marcus's will. He wasn't just being a spineless brother, he was a hostage. The intervention wasn't about my well-being. The property grab wasn't just about greed. It was a desperate, vicious play to settle a decade-old family debt I never even knew existed, by sacrificing my home and my future on the altar of my father's mistakes. The banner, family, means forever. I thought of those garish, bubbly letters, and a laugh escaped my lips, a harsh, humorless sound in the quiet hotel room. Oh, family meant forever, all right. For Marcus, it meant a forever hold on us. My strategy needed to shift. The data was collected, the enemy identified, but a direct assault would be foolish. A legal battle would be slow, messy, and exactly what Marcus, with his army of corporate lawyers, would expect. He thrived in the murky waters of litigation, where truth could be delayed and drowned in billable hours. I needed to fight this on my own terms, using my own weapons, not law, information and psychology. My target was the weakest link in the conspiracy, the vulnerable node in the network, my brother Liam. I knew Liam. I knew the architecture of his soul. He wasn't evil, not in the way Marcus was. Marcus was a black hole of narcissism. Liam was just a vacuum. He was weak-willed, easily swayed by charismatic authority, and possessed a paralyzing terror of failure. He had spent his entire life living in my academic shadow, a fact I'd always tried to downplay, but which Marcus had clearly identified and weaponized. That deep-seated insecurity was the vulnerability I had to exploit. I couldn't threaten him with force. I had to offer him a better way out, a different kind of salvation. I sat in the dim light of my hotel room, the city lights of Seattle glittering below, and composed a single text message. Every word was chosen with surgical precision. Liam, I'm not talking to a lawyer. I'm talking to you, alone, the old pier at Gasworks Park, sunset. Don't bring your phone, don't bring your wife, and don't tell Marcus. If you're even a minute late, my next call is to the SEC to report Marcus's predatory lending practices. Your choice. It was a bluff, mostly. I had no real case for the SEC, not yet, but it was a calculated one. It was a multi-layered attack. It appealed to his fear of Marcus, it severed him from his co-conspirators, and most importantly, it offered him the illusion of control. It was a honey trap, baited with the promise of a private sibling reconciliation he so desperately craved. He showed up. Of course he did. He looked haggard, his usually stylish clothes rumpled dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept since I'd walked through that front door. The setting was deliberate. Gasworks Park, with its colossal rusting industrial skeletons silhouetted against the breathtaking beauty of a Seattle sunset over Lake Union. It felt like a fitting backdrop for our decaying family relationship, a beautiful tragedy. I didn't accuse him. I didn't yell. I let him approach me on the pier, the silence stretching between us broken only by the gentle lapping of the water. I started with a simple, direct question. When did you find out about Dad's debt to Marcus? I asked, my voice soft. His shoulders, already slumped, seemed to collapse entirely. Defeat radiated from him in waves. After Dad died, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper lost in the evening breeze. Marcus, he came to me. He showed me the papers. He said he would take care of it. As long as I kept the family together. He told me Dad's honor was at stake. Dad's honor, the perfect emotional blackmail, the ghost of a good man used as a chain. I didn't react. I just laid out what I knew, my voice calm and logical, as if presenting a theorem. I told him about the holding company, about the personal guarantee that had a lien on our futures, about Marcus's own financial troubles and the coming deadline. I watched Liam's face, and it was like watching a building crumble in slow motion. The denial, the fear, the dawning horrific understanding that he wasn't a partner in this. He was a pawn. He thought he was protecting our father's legacy. Instead, he was helping Marcus strip mine it for parts. He told me you wouldn't understand. Liam mumbled, his eyes fixed on the rotting wood of the pier. He said you'd just see it as numbers and lawyers, that you wouldn't care about the family name. I waited a beat, letting his words hang in the air. And what do you think, Liam? I asked, my voice still soft, but now unyielding, sharp as a shard of glass. After all this, after letting them invade my home, lie to my face, and actively try to steal my future, do you really think this is about the family name? Tears finally welled in his eyes, spilling over and tracing paths through the stubble on his cheeks. He was broken. And that's when I made my move. Marcus has a deadline, doesn't he? I stated, not as a question. He needs the sale of my house to go through fast. What if it doesn't? I let him process that for a moment. What if, instead, a detailed documented summary of his business practices, the predatory loan to Dad, and this entire extortion scheme were to be distributed to every single person currently sleeping in my house, to his investors, to his partners. I let the idea hang in the air, a beautiful, terrible weapon. I wasn't asking him to betray Marcus out of loyalty to me. I was offering him a chance to save himself from the shrapnel. I need access to the original loan documents. Liam, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. The ones Marcus showed you. Not copies, not pictures. The originals. Get them for me. I looked him straight in the eye. That is your only way out of this. He looked up at me, then his tear-filled eyes wide, and in them I saw a maelstrom of emotions, abject terror, desperate hope, and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of the brother I once knew. The trap was sprung. Now I just had to wait and see if he would chew his own leg off to escape. Liam was a mess, but he was a motivated mess. Fear is a powerful catalyst. He agreed to my terms on the pier, his desperate nods barely visible in the deepening twilight. The plan we concocted over a series of encrypted, self-deleting messages was risky, a delicate piece of social engineering with a 0% margin for error. The original documents, the key to everything, were almost certainly in Marcus's briefcase. And that briefcase, Liam confirmed, was in the master bedroom, my bedroom where Marcus and his wife had taken up residence as if they were royalty. Liam's job was to create the diversion. He was the Trojan horse. The reunion was scheduled to have its grand finale the next evening, a massive barbecue at a nearby park. Liam, using the pretense of a fumbling, eager-to-please nephew trying to make a grand peace offering, would convince Marcus that he absolutely needed his help picking up a specialty keg from a new hip brewery across town, a place that was artisan expensive and notorious for its ridiculously long lines. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was perfectly calibrated to play to Marcus's ego. He would relish the role of the magnanimous uncle swooping in to help his flustered nephew proving his own competence and control. While they were gone on their wild goose chase, Chloe and Aunt Carol, the lead party planners, would already be at the park orchestrating the setup. For a brief window of about an hour, the house would be the least populated it had been all weekend. My job was simpler and infinitely more dangerous. Get in, retrieve the file, and get out, undetected. The next evening, as the sun began its slow descent, I arrived on my own street looking like a ghost. I wore all black, my hoodie pulled low, my face obscured by shadow. I parked 3 blocks away and circled around to the back of my property, my feet silent on the pine needle-strewn path of the greenbelt that bordered my yard. The house was quiet, just as we'd planned. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was adrenaline, pure and sharp. I reached under the corner of the deck, my fingers finding the familiar cold metal of the magnetic lockbox. I still had my spare key, the one I kept hidden in a location only I, its creator, knew. The silence inside was unnerving, a hollow echo where the cacophony had been. The party detritus was still everywhere, a ghost of the chaos, a stray plastic cup here, a crushed napkin there. The air was stale with the smell of old food and regret. I moved silently through my own home, every creak of the floorboards a cannon shot in my ears. I went up the stairs, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a beat so loud I was sure it could be heard from the street. My bedroom door was unlocked. The room was a disaster zone of Marcus and his wife's belongings. His expensive suits were thrown over my reading chair. Her makeup was exploded across my vanity. And there on my nightstand next to my favorite lamp was his sleek black leather briefcase. It was, of course, locked, with a 3-digit combination lock. I didn't have time to guess. I had anticipated this. From my pocket, I pulled a small, powerful neodymium magnet I'd taken from a discarded hard drive. I knelt by the briefcase, my breathing shallow. It's a cheap trick that rarely works on high-quality locks, but for a standard mass-produced briefcase lock, sometimes the magnetic pull is just enough to nudge the delicate wheels inside. I ran it slowly over the tumblers. Nothing. I tried again, focusing, imagining the tiny gears turning. Still nothing. My frustration mounted. On the third desperate try, I heard it. A faint click. I held my breath and slid the latches. They sprang open. Inside, nestled among financial reports and property deeds, was a faded blue file folder. The label on the tab, written in my father's elegant cursive, read simply, Vance. My hands trembled as I pulled it out. It contained everything. The original loan agreement signed by my father, in a hand that looked shaky and desperate, the personal guarantee with the horrifying venomous inheritance clause, and most damning of all, a series of handwritten notes on Marcus's letterhead detailing exorbitant interest payments and penalties, a meticulous record of his decade-long bleed-out of my father's legacy. This was it. This was the smoking gun. I pulled out my phone, my fingers flying as I snapped clear, high-resolution photos of every single page. Page 1, page 2, the signature, the fine print, the handwritten notes. Slam. The sound of a car door slamming out front shot through the house like a bullet. My blood turned to ice. My heart leaped into my throat. They were back. They were back early. Panic flared hot and blinding. I shoved the file back into the briefcase, fumbled with the lock, my fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. I scrambled for the bedroom door, peeking through the crack, and I saw her, Chloe, coming up the stairs humming a pop song. She must have forgotten something for the barbecue. There was nowhere to go. My office door was across the hall in her direct line of sight. The closet was too obvious. My only option was the ensuite bathroom. I slipped inside, my feet soundless on the tile, closing the heavy door until it was resting against the frame, leaving only a whisper-thin crack. I held my breath just as she entered the bedroom. I could hear her humming the sound terrifyingly close. I heard the rustle of a suitcase being opened, drawers opening and closing. It felt like an hour. My lungs burned. My muscles screamed. She was looking for something. What if she had to use the bathroom? The thought sent another jolt of ice through my veins. "Found it," she said to herself cheerfully. I heard her footsteps move back across the room. I heard the bedroom door close. I didn't move. I counted to 100 slowly. Then I counted to 100 again. Finally daring to breathe, I slipped out of the bathroom, out of the bedroom, and down the stairs. I was a phantom. I slipped out of the house the way I came, melting back into the shadows of the greenbelt as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. The digital copies of the documents on my phone felt heavier than the original file itself. I had my evidence. Now, it was time to build the weapon. Back in the sterile safety of my hotel room, the adrenaline from the heist finally began to recede, replaced by a current of pure, focused energy. I uploaded the high-resolution photos of the documents to my secure server. The digital copies were clean, crisp, and damning. This was my world now, my area of expertise. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a researcher with a data set. And my family was the subject. For the next 8 hours, I barely moved. The city outside my window faded from bruised purple twilight to the inky black of deep night, and still I worked. Fueled by a pot of lukewarm hotel coffee, I began my analysis. First, I ran the images through a powerful optical character recognition software I'd developed myself, a program designed to read not just text, but context, to recognize the slight tremor in a signature, the angry slash of a handwritten annotation. The chaotic, emotionally charged documents were converted into clean, searchable, analyzable text. I had turned the noise into a signal. Then I began to do what I do best. I built a model. I opened a new coding environment, my fingers flying across the keyboard, the clicks echoing in the silent room. I coded a simple but powerful script, a narrative engine designed to find connections and infer intent from disparate pieces of information. Its purpose was to build an unassailable story of Marcus's financial predation, supported by a web of irrefutable evidence. The input data was everything I had collected in the last 48 hours, the original loan documents, my father's desperate looping signature, the venomous personal guarantee, Marcus's labyrinthine holding company records, public property deeds from 2 states, my own timeline of the reunion planning, a cleaned and transcribed audio file of Liam's whispered confession on the pier, Maya's warnings, and the damning, time-stamped security footage of the Weasley developer touring my home. My algorithm, which I grimly named the Inheritance Clause, began to weave the story. Within minutes, it generated the first visualization, a timeline. It was devastating. The graph showed Marcus's own stock portfolio performance in a jagged red line, and below it in blue, the timeline of the loan to my father. The correlation was undeniable. Every time Marcus's investments took a significant downturn, a new exorbitant service fee or penalty would suddenly appear on the ledger for my father's debt. Marcus wasn't just a creditor, he was a vampire, and he had been feeding on my father for years. Next, the algorithm flagged every legal term in the documents that was predatory or non-standard, highlighting them in bright red. It cross-referenced the reunion's guest list gleaned from the MAC addresses with public business records and social media profiles. The results were staggering. My cousin Barry, from Idaho. The algorithm identified him as a majority shareholder in a failing strip mall owned by one of Marcus's shell companies. Great-Aunt Mildred's husband, a minor investor in that same disastrous commercial real estate fund that was draining Marcus dry. He hadn't just brought family to my house, he had brought his anxious underwater investors to put on a show of confidence and strength. But the most powerful output was the last one, a social network map. It was a stark, elegant, terrifying web of connections with Marcus at the center, a black star radiating lines of influence. The algorithm had even labeled the arrows based on context. An arrow pointed from him to Liam labeled leverage debt. An arrow pointed to Aunt Carol labeled manipulation family unity. Arrows pointed to the investor relatives labeled deception false confidence. And a final thick black arrow pointed directly at a node labeled Ilara Vance. The algorithm had labeled that arrow with 2 simple words, target asset. I stared at the screen, at the cold, hard logic of his plan, laid bare in a diagram. It was more than a legal case. It was a psychological profile of my family's dysfunction rendered in code. The final piece of my project was the delivery system. A simple lawsuit would get buried in court. I needed to detonate this bomb in the heart of the family itself, where the fallout would be personal, immediate, and inescapable. I drafted a master email. The subject line was deliberately neutral regarding the Vance family estate. The body of the email was a concise, emotionless summary of the facts written like a research abstract. No anger, no accusations, just data. It presented the evidence, sequentially allowing the story to unfold step by step. It included encrypted, password-protected hyperlinks to the key documents, the guarantee, the loan, the handwritten notes, and at the very bottom, it displayed the social network map as a crisp JPEG. It ended with a single cold statement. Full documentation has been forwarded to my legal counsel. all future communication regarding this matter should be directed to them. I compiled the mailing list. I scraped the email addresses from Aunt Carol's original reunion planning chains. I found the others through social media alumni networks and public records. It was a comprehensive list. It included every single person who was currently in my house, from Aunt Carol down to the most distant cousin. This wasn't just about exposing Marcus, it was about forcing every single member of the family to choose a side, to look at the ugly truth they had enabled, whether actively or passively. It was my ethical algorithm designed not for a machine, but for them. A test designed to force a moral reckoning. My finger hovered over the mouse. One click, one single click to detonate a decade of lies. With a deep, steadying breath, I clicked send. The fallout was not gradual. It was immediate, and it was spectacular. The moment I hit send, it was like dropping a chemical agent into a sealed environment. The reactions were instantaneous, violent, and utterly chaotic. My phone, which I had set to Do Not Disturb, began to light up with a fury that was almost comical. The screen lying face up on the hotel bedspread became a frantic strobing beacon. A constant silent stream of notifications, emails, texts, missed calls from numbers I hadn't seen in years. I didn't answer a single one. I just sat in the armchair across the room, and I watched. I watched the system I had created execute its program. The first wave of replies was from the Tier 3 inches relatives, the distant cousins and forgotten great-aunts who had just come for a free vacation and a dose of family drama. Their emails were a mix of genuine confusion and sputtering outrage. An email from a cousin in Arizona popped up. "Alara, is this true? Your Uncle Marcus told us this was about supporting you." Another from Great-Aunt Mildred's husband. "I had no idea this was going on. That man used my investment as leverage against your own father. Unconscionable." A text from a cousin I barely knew. "Marcus used us. He made it sound like we were coming here to save you." They were the pawns waking up to find they were on the wrong side of the board. The second wave came from the core family, the enablers, the inner circle. Aunt Carol's text message was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance, a digital howl of indignation. "Alara, this is a private family matter. How dare you air our dirty laundry like this in an email for the whole world to see? You are trying to destroy this family out of pure spite." She wasn't denying the facts. She was furious they were no longer secret. The crime in her eyes wasn't the extortion, it was the exposure. The third and most satisfying wave was the silence. The deafening, beautiful silence from Marcus. No calls, no texts, no blustering denials. He knew with the cold certainty of a cornered animal that he was caught. His power was built on a scaffolding of secrets, whispers, and manipulation, and I had just turned on the floodlights. Then a text from my inside source lit up the screen. It was Maya. She was sending me a running commentary from the barbecue at the park, which according to her had descended into utter chaos. Her first text, "OMG Alara." Everyone's phones started going off at once, like at the exact same time. A minute later, people are screaming at each other, literally screaming. Cousin Barry just threw a beer at Uncle David. Aunt Carol is crying into a bowl of potato salad. And the final update, Uncle Marcus and his friends, the investors, they didn't say a word. They just got in their cars and left. Just gone. Now Chloe is blaming Liam for everything. She's yelling that he's weak and he ruined her life. It's a total meltdown. My brother Liam called me once during this storm. I watched his name flash on the screen and I let it go to voicemail. The message he left, which I listened to an hour later, was just 3 words choked with static and a terrible, ragged despair. "I'm so sorry," he'd sobbed. The Family Means Forever group chat, the one Chloe had created and which I had been silently monitoring, became a war zone. The carefully constructed facade of loving unity evaporated in an instant. "How could you not tell us?" Carol, one message read. "Marcus played us all for fools, and you let him read another. My husband and I flew here on our own dime because you said Alara was in trouble. Accusations flew. Alliances shattered in real time. People who had been laughing and singing off-key karaoke together just 24 hours earlier were now digitally tearing each other to shreds, accusing one another of greed, deceit, and betrayal. I watched it all unfold, not with glee, but with a strange surgical detachment. I had not destroyed the family. I had simply held up a mirror, and they had destroyed themselves. That evening, as the chaos finally began to die down, I did something I hadn't done in years. I used the hotel's room service and ordered a single chilled, expensive bottle of Veuve Clicquot. I sat by the window, looking out at the glittering lights of the city that was truly my home, and I poured myself a glass. I raised it to the empty room to the reflection of my own tired face in the dark glass. "I hope you're resting easy, Dad," I whispered, my voice thick. "I've cleaned up your mess." The unraveling was not just about justice, it was a form of liberation. The weight of their expectations, their judgments, their suffocating secret history. I could feel it all lifting off me like a physical pressure I hadn't even realized I was carrying. It was all gone, burned away in the clean, bright fire of the truth. A week after the email, the digital mushroom cloud began to dissipate and the dust began to settle, revealing a landscape of absolute ruin. The Family Means Forever banner was not just torn, it had been incinerated. The silence from the front lines was profound. Marcus, as I learned from a gleeful text from Maya, had vanished. He had reportedly holed up in his sprawling Portland estate, refusing all calls even from his most frantic investors. The only communication from his camp was a single terse letter sent from his legal team to my newly retained lawyer. It was a masterpiece of brevity. It stated in cold legalese that their client would not be pursuing any claims financial or otherwise related to the Vance estate debt now or in the future. It was a silent, unconditional surrender. He was cutting his losses and retreating into the shadows. The family had fractured along predictable lines. Most had simply retreated, scattering back to their respective states, deeply ashamed or bitterly angry. My phone had finally fallen silent. Aunt Carol, I was told, had officially declared me a pariah, a malicious force who had attacked the family. It was a narrative that gave her comfort, I'm sure. And Chloe, in a move that surprised no one, had taken their young son and gone to stay with her parents, leaving Liam utterly alone in the downstairs portion of my house to face the consequences of his choices. And it was Liam I now had to deal with. He was the last piece of unresolved business. He sent me a long, rambling email 3 days after the detonation. It was a pathetic symphony of self-pity, half-hearted apologies, and thinly veiled blame. He was broke, he wrote. Chloe had drained their joint bank account. Marcus wasn't returning his calls. He was facing eviction from his own home, as he couldn't possibly afford the mortgage payments on his half a loan. He was at my mercy, and we both knew it. I let him stew in that misery for 3 days. I let him check his email every 5 minutes. I let him feel the full crushing weight of his powerlessness. Then and only then did I respond. My reply was a single sentence: "I will meet you at the house tomorrow at noon. Be there." When I walked in the next day using my own key and my own front door, the house was spotless. Eerily so. Liam, in what I could only assume was a desperate multi-day act of penance, had scrubbed every inch of the place. The jam smear was gone from the wall. The floors shone. The lingering smell of stale beer and betrayal had been replaced by the sharp, clean scent of lemon polish. He had erased all physical traces of the reunion. He was sitting at my dining room table, his back ramrod straight. He looked like a ghost. His face was pale and hollowed out, his eyes red-rimmed and defeated. When he stood up as I entered, it was the movement of a man expecting a blow. He started to speak, the apology already forming on his lips. "Ellie, I held up a hand, cutting him off. I sat down across from him, my expression unreadable. "I'm not interested in your apologies, Liam," I said, my voice even and cool. "They're useless data at this point. I'm interested in solutions." I slid a slim manila folder across the polished surface of the table. It landed in front of him with a soft, final thud. "My lawyer has drafted 2 options for you," I explained. "You need to listen very carefully." He stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. "Option A," I began, "is the clean break. I will buy out your 50% share of the house. The price will be based on its current fair market value, minus your portion of the legal fees I have incurred, and minus the $5,000 cost of professionally cleaning the carpets and repairing the damage from your party. You will walk away with a small amount of cash, and you will be free. Of the house of the debt of me. I let that sink in. Freedom. It was a tempting offer. Option B. I continued, my voice dropping slightly as the lease of penance. He flinched at the name. Under this option, you can stay. But you will no longer be a co-owner. You will sign over your deed to me in its entirety. In exchange, I will personally absorb your share of the remaining mortgage debt. You will then become my tenant, living downstairs under a strict ironclad 1-year lease agreement. That lease will have clauses for behavior, for noise levels, for property maintenance, and for regular quarterly inspections conducted by me. At the end of the year, if you have abided by every single term of that lease, we can discuss a potential path for you to eventually buy back a minority share in the property at a future market value determined by me. It was a harsh offer, it was brutal, but it was also a lifeline. It gave him a chance to stay in his home, to maybe even win his wife back, to rebuild his shattered life. But it would be entirely and completely on my terms. I stood up my chair, scraping softly against the floor. You get to choose, Liam, I told him, my voice devoid of any emotion, any pity. You can have your freedom, or you can have a chance to earn back my trust. You don't get both. He stared at the documents for a long, silent time, his hands trembling slightly where they rested on the table. The entire weight of his future was contained in that simple manila folder, and the choice was his alone. Liam chose option B. In the end, after staring at that folder for what felt like an hour, his gaze shifting between the two stark possibilities for his future, he chose penance. He chose to stay. I think in that moment the thought of being truly cast out, of being completely severed from the last physical connection to our parents and our childhood, was a fate more terrifying to him than total submission to me. The process that followed was swift, cold, and clinical. There were no more emotional confrontations. There were only lawyers. Papers were drawn up, couriered, back and forth, and signed in separate sterile offices. The deed was transferred. The title was cleared. And just like that, with the stroke of a notary's pen, I was the sole owner of the house I had fought so hard for. And Liam, my brother, was now my tenant. The power dynamic in our relationship had been irrevocably, fundamentally rewritten. Our interactions became formal, stilted, almost absurdly so. I set him up on a property management app, the kind landlords use for apartment buildings. That became our sole method of communication. There were no more texts, no phone calls. If he needed something, he had to submit a formal request. Maintenance request. Kitchen faucet unit B. Slow drip from hot water handle. I would review it and type my reply. Approved. Plumber will arrive Thursday between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. Please ensure access. The first few months were tense. I moved back into my pristine, reclaimed space upstairs, and I could feel his resentment radiating up through the floorboards. It was a palpable, simmering humiliation. I would hear him pacing at night, or the sound of a cabinet slamming shut with just a little too much force. He was a prisoner in his own home, and I was the warden, but slowly, very slowly, something began to shift. Without Chloe's constant pressure to keep up appearances, without Uncle Marcus's poisonous influence whispering in his ear, Liam began to resemble the brother I remembered from our childhood, quiet, thoughtful, good with his hands. The angry energy started to curdle into a kind of melancholic purpose. One Saturday I got a notification from the app. Maintenance request backyard unit B, overgrowth of weeds and dead bushes, requesting permission to re-landscape. I approved it. For the next 2 weekends he worked tirelessly. He tore out the dead plants, tilled the soil, and planted a small, beautiful garden of native wildflowers. He fixed the broken stone on the walkway. He did it all without being asked, a silent act of contrition written in dirt and stone. He paid his rent on time to the minute every single month. He was trying. During this time, living alone in my fortress of solitude, I made a decision. I kept thinking about the origin of this whole crisis. That dark tangled knot of my father's debt, that predatory loan, the inheritance he had mortgaged away. It was a dirty legacy, a stain on his memory. I could either let it define him, and by extension us, or I could transform it. I could perform a kind of alchemy. I contacted my lawyer and my financial advisor. I established a new charitable foundation, the Vance Grant for Ethical Technology. It would be an annual fellowship, a significant sum awarded to a young PhD candidate or postdoc researcher working on projects that promote transparency, accountability, and fairness in artificial intelligence. I funded the initial grant with the exact amount of money I would have spent buying out Liam's half of the house under Option A. When it came time to design the grant's commemorative plaque, I paused. I thought for a long time about the wording. Finally, I settled on an inscription. It read, "In memory of James Vance, a man who believed in building a better future." May this grant serve as a perpetual reminder that good intentions must always be fortified with unwavering integrity. It didn't call him a perfect man. It didn't hide from the truth. It honored the father I loved, while acknowledging the flawed man I had discovered. The public announcement of the grant sent out through the university and tech industry channels sent quiet ripples through what was left of the family. It wasn't an olive branch. It was a public declaration of my values. It was me taking the ugliest part of our family's history, the very weapon they had tried to use against me, and turning it into something positive, something that looked toward the future, not the past. Maya called me the day after the press release went out. I could hear the smile in her voice. "That," she said, laughing a little, "is the most Alara Vance thing you could have possibly done. I'm not sure what that means." I replied, though, of course I did. "It means," she said, her voice full of admiration, "that you didn't just win Alara. You rewrote the entire game." She was right. The inheritance clause, that venomous line of fine print that was supposed to be my chain, was now a source of its own potential redemption. I had seized control of the narrative, and I was finally writing my own ending. A year to the day after I walked in on the reunion, I was sitting on my deck, a cup of tea, growing cold in my hands, looking out at the calm gray expanse of the Puget Sound. A lone ferry glided across the water, a silent, steady presence. The house was quiet. Not the sterile, anxious quiet of my hotel room, but a deep settled peace, a peace I had earned. Downstairs through the open window of his apartment, I could hear the faint melodic sound of Liam playing his acoustic guitar. It was a soft, intricate melody, something I hadn't heard him play in years, not since before he'd met Chloe, before he'd started trying to be someone he wasn't. He was rediscovering the parts of himself he'd abandoned. His wife, Chloe, had recently started bringing their son over for quiet weekend visits. They were attempting a reconciliation, a slow, tentative process built this time on a foundation less about social climbing and more about actual partnership. I hoped it would work. For their son's sake, we still weren't close, Liam and I, and perhaps we never would be again. The trust once shattered doesn't just mend itself. You can see the cracks forever. But in its place something new had grown, a kind of wary respect, a shared understanding forged in the fire. He respected my boundaries, because they were now legally binding, written in the cold, clear language of a lease agreement. And I respected his effort. I respected the quiet dignity with which he was trying to rebuild. That afternoon, as I was reviewing some data from the lab, the doorbell rang. It was a delivery driver with a small square package. The return address was in Portland. My stomach gave a familiar reflexive clench before I saw the name. It was from Aunt Carol. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity, a scientist's most stubborn trait, got the better of me. I took it inside and carefully cut the tape. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a small hand-stitched sampler in a simple wooden frame. The stitching was neat, the colors muted. It had a single unadorned phrase stitched in the center. It said, "Family is a choice." There was no note, no long, rambling letter of apology. None was needed. It was her white flag, her silent, begrudging acknowledgement of the New World Order, a concession from the woman who had once screamed that I was destroying her family. I placed it on the bookshelf in my office not as a trophy, but as a reminder. My life is still a series of controlled environments, but the architecture has changed. I've learned that you cannot control people, their greed, their weakness, their capacity for betrayal. You can only control your response to them. I've learned that you can build firewalls to protect your own integrity. You can create systems of accountability, and you can and must define the terms of your own existence. My family isn't forever in the way that garish Banner proclaimed. It's not an unbreakable, unconditional bond that gives others the right to occupy your space and dictate your future. It's a structure, and like any structure, it requires maintenance. It requires clear boundaries and mutual respect, and sometimes it needs to be stripped down to the studs and rebuilt on a stronger, more honest foundation. My home is no longer just a sanctuary, it's a testament. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the most loving thing a family member can do is to hold the others accountable, to refuse to participate in the comforting lies, to burn the whole rotten structure down so that maybe, just maybe, something better can be built in its place. My name is Dr. Alara Vance. I once came home to find 99 people in my house trying to tear my life down. They failed. And in the process, I discovered what my family and I were truly made of. So, that's where the story ends, in the quiet, in the stillness after the storm. But in another way, that's where my life truly began. The person who walked into that house a year ago, she doesn't exist anymore. She was an algorithm running on faulty code, trying to solve for an variable called family approval that was never going to be satisfied. The woman sitting here now understands the system differently, and since you've stayed with me this long, I feel like I owe you the lessons I learned from the wreckage. The first, and maybe the hardest lesson, is about boundaries. We're often taught that boundaries are walls we build to keep people out. But that's not right. Boundaries aren't walls. They are instructions. They are a calm, clear manual for how others are allowed to treat us. For years, I operated without them hoping my silence and my success would be enough. It wasn't. Walking out of my home that night, that was the first true boundary I ever set. It wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of profound self-respect. It was the first time I realized that saying no to their chaos was the only way to truly say yes to myself. The second lesson is about fighting your own fight. My Uncle Marcus's weapons were intimidation, emotional blackmail, and brute force. For a moment I was tempted to meet him on that battlefield, to scream, to yell, to create a scene. But that's his game, not mine. My power, my real power, was in my quiet office with my code and my data. I won not by being louder, but by being smarter, by being more me. They brought a sledgehammer to what they thought was a fist fight, but it was a chess match, and I was the one who had designed the board. Never let anyone else dictate the terms of your own battle. Use the weapons you have forged your entire life to master, and that leads to the hardest part of all this. Family. That banner, family means forever. It's a phrase that's meant to sound like a warm blanket, but for so many of us, it can feel like a cage. It can be used to justify bad behavior, to demand loyalty where none is earned, and to silence the truth. What happened in my family forced me to ask a very difficult question. At what point does unconditional love become unconditional permission to cause harm? I don't believe my brother is evil. I believe he was a hostage to a legacy of fear. But his choices were still his own. And the only way for him to begin healing wasn't for me to forgive him instantly. It was for him to face the consequences of his actions. Accountability is the soil in which real trust can maybe one day grow again. I suppose if I had to distill this entire painful, liberating year into a single thought, it would be this. The architecture of our lives is not defined by the family we are born into, but by the boundaries we have the courage to build. So now I want to ask you, have you ever had to be the bad guy to protect your own peace? Has a family obligation ever crossed the line into a violation of your own life? I truly want to know. If this story made you think, or if it resonated with a piece of your own life, please leave a comment below. If you have a different opinion on accountability versus forgiveness, I'd love to hear it. Please share it in the comments. And if you appreciate stories that go deep into the messy, complicated, but ultimately hopeful parts of life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next story we explore together. Thank you, truly, for listening.